The X-302 pilot had 3 seconds to realize the asteroid was looking at him. Lieutenant Hamill had flown intercept runs on Goa'uld death gliders, had punched through hyperspace windows in experimental craft that rattled his teeth and made his vision strobe white, had once strafed a Haytak mothership at close enough range to feel the heat bloom through his cockpit glass. He was not, by any reasonable military definition, a man who frightened easily. But when the object that NORAD's Deep Space Tracking Array had designated Anomaly 7 rotated, slowly, deliberately, with the grinding gravitational patience of something that measured time in geological epochs, and oriented what could only be described as a face toward his cockpit, Lieutenant Hamill forgot every call sign, every protocol, and every piece of Air Force training he had ever received. He keyed his radio with a hand that was not entirely steady. "Cheyenne, this is Hamill. In anomaly. 7 is... It's looking at me. Over." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds longer than it should have. "Say again, Lieutenant." It turned control. 140-degree rotation, unprompted, oriented toward my position. "This thing is aware of me." He banked hard left on instinct, putting distance between himself and the object. 300 meters of pitted, dark rock that had registered on initial scans as an unremarkable carbonaceous chondrite, tracked him. Slowly. Inexorably. The way a cathedral might turn if cathedrals had patience and hunger and the cold, comprehensive intelligence of deep space. "I'm recommending immediate..." The electromagnetic pulse hit his instruments like a fist. Not destructive, not a weapon discharge, nothing like the hard spectrum blast of a staff weapon or the bone-deep thrum of Asgard beaming technology. When this was structured, layered, a cascade of modulated frequencies that his instruments tried to parse and failed, that his flight computer flagged as corrupted data, and then, almost hesitantly, began to log as signal. Something was transmitting through his aircraft's communication array, through the metal skin of the X-302 itself, and the transmission was complex enough that for 3 full seconds, Lieutenant Hamill's heads-up display simply read, "Processing." In the gate room of Cheyenne Mountain, every screen flickered simultaneously. "What the hell was that?" General George Hammond was already out of his chair, moving to the control room railing, his broad frame filling the doorway as technicians scrambled across their consoles. Sergeant Davis had both hands on his keyboard, pulling up sensor feeds, his face cycling through professional calm towards something less composed. "Sir, we're receiving a signal. Broadband electromagnetic. I-complex modulation, origin point..." Davis stopped. Rechecked his readings. "Origin point is Anomaly 7, sir. It's broadcasting directly through Earth's ionosphere. Every receiver on the planet that's sensitive enough is currently picking this up." Hammond absorbed this with the particular stillness of a man who has stood in this room and watched the Stargate connect to enemy worlds, who has ordered nuclear warheads through wormholes and negotiated with beings that wore human faces like masks. Get me SG-1. Now. They were already coming through the door. Colonel Jack O'Neill moved with the unhurried speed of a man who had learned long ago that running conveyed panic, and panic was contagious. Behind him, Major Samantha Carter was already reading the signal data on a tablet, her expression doing the particular thing it did when she encountered something that exceeded her current frameworks. Not confusion exactly, but a hungry, almost aggressive focus. But Daniel Jackson was still pulling on his jacket. Teal'c walked at the rear with the composed, measured tread of a first prime who had served false gods for decades and had long since stopped being surprised by the universe's capacity for the extraordinary. "Talk to me, Carter," O'Neill said, taking position beside Hammond without preamble. "Sir, the object entered our tracking range 14 hours ago on a standard intercept trajectory. We classified it as a potential impact hazard, our low probability. Automated systems flagged it for monitoring." She pulled up the deep space imagery on the main screen. A mass of dark, irregular rock, surface texture almost fractal in its complexity, pitted and ridged in patterns that the eye kept trying to resolve into structure. 62 minutes ago it decelerated. Not gravitational influence, not orbital mechanics. Active deceleration, sir. Then Hamill's intercept confirmed directional awareness and the EM pulse. She paused. "It knows we're here. It came here." "How big?" Daniel asked quietly, staring at the screen. Approximately 340 meters at longest axis. Mass consistent with a mid-size rocky body, but Carter hesitated in a way that was distinctly uncharacteristic. The internal density readings don't match. There are cavities, structures, and the surface temperature is reading 11 degrees Celsius warmer than it should be given solar distance and albedo. It's alive, Daniel said. It's not a question. It's biological, Carter confirmed, or at least partially. The EM signal is being generated internally, not from any attached technology. It's the transmitter. O'Neill looked at the screen for a long moment. At the dark, patient mass of rock drifting through the cold distance between Earth and Mars, turning with that terrible, slow awareness toward their world. Daniel. He kept his voice level. In all your years of reading ancient texts, alien databases, and things that gave you nightmares for a month, have you ever read anything about a living asteroid? Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the screen. No, he said, but I want to. Of course you do. O'Neill turned back to Hammond. Sir, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this falls outside standard first contact protocol. Hammond's expression was composed, grave, and entirely certain. Then we write new protocol, Colonel. Starting now? He looked at Carter. On Major. That signal. Can we respond? Carter was already working. Give me 20 minutes, sir. Outside, 340 meters of ancient living stone drifted closer to the world that had, millions of years and unimaginable suffering ago, been its origin point. And in the structured cascade of its electromagnetic transmission, layered in frequencies that human instruments were only beginning to parse, something that might have been recognition, or grief, or fury, or all three wound together beyond any easy separation, pulsed steadily outward into the dark. The signal was not a language, not exactly. Carter had commandeered every available workstation in the SGC's main lab, pulled Dr. Lee away from a Naquata reactor calibration he'd been complaining about for 3 weeks, and requisitioned the Deep Space Array's full bandwidth within 40 minutes of Hammond's order. What she found when she began unpeeling the transmission's layered structure was not a cipher waiting to be cracked, not a mathematical universal language of the kind SETI theorists had dreamed about for decades. It was something simultaneously simpler and more disorienting than any of that. It was pattern recognition bait. It's showing us things it expects us to recognize, she said, 3 hours into analysis, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had not blinked enough recently. O'Neill stood behind her with a coffee he'd stopped drinking 20 minutes ago. Geometric progressions, prime sequences, standard enough. But layered underneath those, there are biological signal patterns, electrochemical cascades, neural firing sequences. O'Neill set down the coffee. It's showing us brain activity? It's showing us its brain activity, specifically the portions that are currently processing us. She pulled up a waveform visualization that sprawled across 3 monitors, peaks and valleys of extraordinary complexity, rippling in near real time from the ongoing transmission. Yes, it's thinking at us, sir, showing us the shape of its own cognition as a form of introduction. That's either very sophisticated or very unsettling, O'Neill said. Almost certainly both, Daniel said from the corner, where he'd been cross-referencing the signal patterns against every xenolinguistic framework in the SGC database for the past 2 hours and finding consistent, maddening near-matches. He pulled up his notes. The pattern architecture, the way concepts are nested inside each other, the recursive self-referential structures, it's not like anything in the ancient database or the Asgard linguistic records. But there are elements that remind me of pre-linguistic cognitive structures. The way very early hominid remains show evidence of symbolic thought before formal language developed. He paused, aware of how what he was about to say would land. This thing thinks in ways that predate organized language, not because it's primitive, because it's so old that language as we understand it is a recent innovation it may have passed through and left behind. The room processed this quietly. How old are we talking? O'Neill asked. The ancients evolved, built the gate network, seeded the galaxy, and ascended over a span of millions of years, Daniel said carefully. The signal architecture suggests cognitive development that makes the ancients look recent. Teal'c, who had been standing in characteristic stillness near the doorway, spoke. Among the oldest Jaffa oral traditions there are accounts, dismissed as metaphor by most scholars of the Goa'uld, of entities encountered in deep space during the earliest Goa'uld expansion. Beings described as mountains that breathed. The system lords forbade discussion of them. He paused with the weight of a man choosing his next words precisely. The accounts do not describe the encounters as going well for the Goa'uld. O'Neill looked at him. You're just mentioning this now? I did not consider the accounts credible until approximately 40 minutes ago. Hammond's voice came through the intercom before O'Neill could respond. Colonel O'Neill, we have a development. My office. All of you. The development was Thor. The Asgard Supreme Commander's holographic projection materialized above Hammond's desk, with the characteristic soft displacement of Asgard beaming technology, his large gray head tilting in the manner that O'Neill had learned to read as the Asgard equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. General Hammond, Colonel O'Neill. The enormous dark eyes moved to the deep space feed still running on Hammond's wall screen. I see you are already aware. You know what that is, O'Neill said. Not a question. We have records. Thor's projection was still for a moment in a way that felt weighted. Incomplete records. The entity your instruments have designated anomaly. 7 belongs to a category of organism the Asgard have encountered only twice in our history. Both encounters were observed from significant distance. The dark eyes didn't blink. We did not approach closely enough to make contact on either occasion. Hammond leaned forward. Why not? Caution, Thor said simply. These organisms are extraordinarily ancient. Our best analysis of cellular degradation rates and cosmic ray exposure patterns in specimens observed from distance suggests individual lifespans measured in millions of years, possibly longer. A pause that felt almost respectful. More significantly, our biological analysis indicates they are not alien in origin. Their base genetic architecture, buried beneath millions of years of radical modification, is... Another pause. It is human, Art General Hammond. Or rather, it derives from the same rootstock from which your species descends. The silence in Hammond's office was the particular quality of silence that falls when something reorders the furniture of the mind. They were people, Daniel said quietly. Something made them this way, Carter said, and her voice had an edge to it. Something changed them. Our records are fragmentary, Thor said, but they suggest a civilization of extraordinary power. Not the ancients, not the Ori, something distinct, that engaged in large-scale biological restructuring of developing civilizations, forcing evolution, reshaping species. The hologram's head tilted again. The Asgard have a name for this category of intervention. We call it the Great Cruelty. O'Neill was quiet for a moment, looking at the screen where the dark mass of the Asteromorph continued its slow, patient drift toward the inner solar system. So that thing out there, he said finally, was human once. Something grabbed its ancestors and turned them into living rocks. And now it's here. He looked at Thor. Any idea why? Thor's response was not immediate, which, with the Asgard, meant something. Our records suggest these organisms navigate by stellar memory. They know the positions of stars across millions of years of drift. They remember where they came from. The dark eyes held the screen. Yeah, it is possible this one has been traveling toward the coordinates of its origin world for a very long time. Everyone looked at the image of Earth on the feed. It's coming home, Daniel said. The Asteromorph crossed the orbit of Mars at 0347 hours Mountain Time, and the SGC did not sleep. Carter had rigged a response transmitter from a combination of the Deep Space Array's broadcast hardware and 3 salvaged Asgard communication components that Thor had materialized onto her workstation with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that the situation had moved beyond standard diplomatic channels. The transmitter could generate modulated electromagnetic pulses in the frequency range the Asteromorph was using, could layer pattern structures into the signal with enough complexity to convey intentionality. Whether it could convey anything the astromorph would recognize as meaningful was the question that had kept Carter awake and increasingly caffeinated through the small hours of the morning. "The problem," she said, "I pulling up the transmission architecture on the main lab screen while O'Neill, Daniel, and Teal'c arranged themselves around her with the practiced ease of a team that had stood in crisis rooms together enough times to have assigned positions without ever discussing it, is that we're trying to communicate with something that thinks in pre-linguistic cognitive structures millions of years old, using radio wave modulation we developed in the last century." She rubbed her eyes. "It's like trying to explain calculus to someone using only interpretive dance." "I've seen Daniel do worse," O'Neill said. "I'm right here," Daniel said. "I know." O'Neill looked at the waveform display, at the ongoing pulse of the Asteromorphs transmission, still washing over Earth's receivers in its layered, recursive complexity. "What can we send it?" "Emotion maps," Daniel said, before Carter could answer. Both of them looked at him. Now he was staring at his notes with the focused intensity he got when something was assembling itself in his mind faster than he could consciously track. The signal structure Carter identified, the nested cognitive patterns, the self-referential loops. That's not how language works, but it's very close to how emotional memory works, the way traumatic or profound experiences encode in human neurology. Deeply nested, self-referential, resistant to linear decoding. He looked up. "Oh, it's not talking to us. It's remembering at us, showing us the shape of its own history through the emotional architecture of how that history was experienced." Carter stared at him. "So to respond in kind, we'd need to transmit something emotionally structured. Not words, not mathematics." Daniel spread his hands. "Something that conveys experience, recognition. I'm the shape of knowing something profound happened and that we understand, even partially, what that means." O'Neill was quiet for a moment. "Carter, can the transmitter do that?" "I can modulate the signal to mirror the astromorph's own pattern architecture," she said slowly, working through it in real time. "Essentially reflect its cognitive structure back at it with modifications that indicate reception and," she paused, "and sympathy. Now whether it reads that as genuine communication or interference I can't guarantee." "Do it," O'Neill said. While Carter worked, Thor's hologram reappeared at the lab's secondary station, which had become an informal Asgard liaison point over the past several hours. O'Neill drifted toward it with the deliberate casualness that meant he was about to ask something he suspected he wouldn't enjoy the answer to. "Thor, the thing that did this to them, the civilization that reshaped these people into," he gestured at the screen, "into that. Are they still around?" The pause was long enough to be its own answer. "Our records do not indicate their continued presence in this galaxy," Thor said carefully, "or any galaxy within our survey range. But," Thor's large eyes held his steadily, "the modifications made to the ancestors of these organisms demonstrate a level of biological engineering that exceeds Asgard capability. Significantly, whatever civilization achieved this possessed scientific knowledge that we have not replicated and do not fully understand." Another pause. "The scale of what was done, the number of species affected across multiple star systems, suggests a civilization of extraordinary reach and power." "And they're just gone," O'Neill said flatly. "It would appear so." "Things with that kind of power don't just go away, Thor." "No," Thor agreed quietly. "They do not." Before O'Neill could pursue this, the waveform display spiked. Every monitor in the lab flared with a surge of incoming signals so intense that two of the secondary screens tripped their overload protections and went dark. Carter's hands flew across her keyboard, pulling back the receiver sensitivity before the array burned out, and in the sudden cacophony of data that flooded the remaining screens, something became visible in the pattern structure that hadn't been there before. "It responded," Carter said, while her voice stripped down to pure focus. "It responded to our transmission." Her fingers moved rapidly, peeling back the signal layers. "It received the emotional architecture we sent, and it's layering onto it, building on top of what we transmitted." She worked in silence for 30 seconds that felt considerably longer. "Daniel, you need to see this." Daniel moved to her station and looked at the pattern visualization she'd isolated, His expression shifted through several things in quick succession before settling into something carefully composed. "What is it?" O'Neill asked. "It's a memory," Daniel said. "Or the closest thing to a memory that this signal architecture can convey." He traced the nested pattern structures on the screen with one finger, not touching the glass. "There's a before and after structure here. Two distinct cognitive states separated by something the pattern treats as catastrophic rupture. The before state has characteristics I'd associate with," he searched for the word, "with community, interconnection, multiple cognitive signatures woven together." He moved his finger to the second pattern cluster. "The after state is solitary, adrift, and there's a third element nested inside both of them." "Which is?" O'Neill said. Daniel looked up from the screen. "It's looking for something it lost," he said. "Something it's been looking for across... I can't quantify the timescale from this, but... Jack, the depth of this..." He stopped, collected himself. "It's been alone for a very long time, and it thinks that what it lost might be here." The room sat with that for a moment. Teal'c broke the silence with characteristic precision. "If this being has traveled across the void for millions of years in search of something it lost on this world," he said, "we should determine what that something is before it arrives and searches for it directly." Outside, the Asteromorph crossed the last 1,000,000 kilometers toward Earth's gravitational sphere with the patience of geological time and the purpose of something that had never, across all the cold millennia of its drifting, forgotten the coordinates of home. Anubis saw it first through the eyes of a dead man. The host he currently occupied had been a minor Goa Old Lord named Herak's predecessor, a system lord of middling ambition whose Hatak had been patrolling the outer rim of the Milky Way's third arm when the energy signature registered on sensors designed to detect exactly this kind of anomaly. Anubis had built those sensors himself, so drawing on knowledge pulled from the ancient repository he had partially accessed before his incomplete ascension had been forcibly reversed. Knowledge that the other system lords didn't possess, couldn't possess, because they had never stood in the space between physical existence and the higher plane, and looked down at the galaxy with eyes that briefly, insufficiently, saw everything. He had known something like this was possible, where the ancient database fragments he'd absorbed before Omadasala's intervention had included references, fragmented, partially corrupted but there, to organisms of biological impossibility drifting through the deep void. The ancients had called them, in the dry classificatory language of beings who had seen everything and been moved by very little, the reshaped. And in the same database entry, buried in a notation so understated it had taken Anubis 3 years of processing to fully extract its implications, was a single line that had reorganized every strategic calculation he had made since. The reshaped retain, in degraded but recoverable form, the complete genetic memory of the Alteran seeding programs. The ancients had seeded humanity, had distributed human genetic material across the galaxy as a vast long-term experiment in evolution's possibilities. The Asteromorph, this drifting, continental, impossible organism now decelerating toward the Tauri homeworld, carried in its biological architecture a record of that program. Every modification, every seeded world, every genetic template the ancients had ever deployed. In the wrong hands, that information was the master key to every human world in the galaxy. Anubis was not interested in being a god. He was interested in being the only thing left. He issued 3 orders in quick succession from the Hatak's command throne, his voice carrying the dual resonance of a Goa Old in full control of a host who had long since stopped trying to resist. First, signal concealment, full spectrum. The Hatak would approach the Tauri system on minimal power, sensors passive, running dark. Second, dispatch a cloaked Teltac scout to within observation range of the organism. He needed biological samples if possible, direct sensor readings if not. The third, prepare the experimental biological extraction unit that his scientists had spent 4 years building based on ancient medical technology and had never yet had appropriate test subjects for. He would not engage the Tauri directly. Not yet. Not when they were already in contact with the organism, and therefore potentially extracting the same genetic intelligence he wanted. Patience was the virtue that separated Anubis from every other system lord, of the quality they mistook for weakness until the moment it became their ending. He would watch. He would learn. And when the moment presented itself, he would take everything. The SGC learned about Anubis's interest the way they learned about most things they would have preferred not to know, abruptly and at the worst possible time. The Tok'ra operative known to SGC records as Aldwin 7, the designation reflecting the 7th Tok'ra agent to use that cover identity in the past decade, came through the Stargate at 11:42 hours with a GDO signal that cleared the iris and an expression on the host's face that Colonel O'Neill had learned to read as the Tok'ra version of controlled alarm, which was considerably more alarming than most species' uncontrolled versions. "We have intelligence," Aldwin 7 said, without preamble, in the gate room, before Hammond had even reached the bottom of the stairs. "Anubis has repositioned 3 Haytak vessels to the outer edge of your system in the past 6 hours. They are running silent." Hammond absorbed this with military stillness. What's his interest? The organism. The Tok'ra operative's eyes carried the slight luminescence of a symbiote, fully engaged, processing and communicating simultaneously. "Our agent within Anubis's science division, I will not compromise their position by specifying further, reports that Anubis has been searching for one of these organisms for 11 years. He has ancient knowledge, General, partial, corrupted, but sufficient to understand what these beings carry in their biology." A pause weighted with Tok'ra precision. "If he extracts what he's looking for, every human world in this galaxy becomes a resource he can locate, catalog, and exploit with a completeness no system lord has ever achieved." O'Neill had been leaning against the gate room wall with his arms crossed, in a posture that conveyed relaxation and meant the opposite. "So we have a living asteroid coming in for a visit that might be looking for something it lost here millions of years ago, and Anubis running dark on the edge of the system waiting to vivisect it." He looked at Hammond. "Normal Tuesday?" "Colonel," Hammond said, in the tone that meant not helpful but noted. "Sir," O'Neill straightened, "we need to speed up communication. If we can establish genuine contact with the Asteromorph before Anubis moves, we have options. If Anubis moves first..." He didn't finish the sentence because the end of it was obvious and unpleasant. Teal'c had been standing at parade rest near the gate ramp, listening with the comprehensive attention he gave everything. "There is an additional consideration," he said. "The Jaffa oral traditions I referenced earlier, the accounts of the System Lord's early encounters with these organisms." He looked at O'Neill directly. "The accounts specify that the Goa'uld attempted to take one as a host." The gate room went quiet in a specific way. "I'm going to assume that didn't go well," O'Neill said. "The account uses the phrase, 'the mountain swallowed the god and did not notice,'" Teal'c said. "Right." O'Neill turned to Hammond. "General, I need Carter to have whatever she needs, and I need it in the next 3 hours." Hammond was already nodding. "Make it 2. Daniel Jackson had not slept in 31 hours and was experiencing the specific clarity that arrives somewhere beyond exhaustion, where the mind strips away everything non-essential and operates on the bare architecture of pure focus. He sat alone in the secondary lab with 6 monitors running simultaneously, cross-referencing the Asteromorphs' signal patterns against every database the SGC had accumulated across 8 years of gate travel. Ancient repositories, Asgard linguistic records, Tok'ra historical archives, the partial Goa'uld genetic memory transcriptions that Teal'c had helped compile during his early years with the program. Most of it was producing nothing useful. The Asteromorphs' cognitive architecture was old enough that even the ancients' oldest recorded materials felt recent by comparison, like trying to find a medieval manuscript that referenced something that happened before the dinosaurs. But there were traces, not language, not records. It was something more fundamental. The way a particular arrangement of stones in a riverbed tells you about the glacier that deposited them 10,000 years before anyone was there to watch. The Asteromorph signal contained embedded pattern structures that recurred in ancient mathematics in the same way that certain prime relationships recur across independently developed number systems. Not because the Asteromorph had learned from the ancients, but because both had learned from the same source, like the same origin. Daniel was building a working hypothesis that was making the sleep-deprived portions of his mind deeply uncomfortable, and he'd learned over 8 years of gate travel to pay attention to that specific discomfort. Carter appeared in the doorway at 1400 hours with 2 mugs of coffee and the expression she wore when her own working hypothesis had just intersected uncomfortably with observable reality. She set 1 mug in front of him without asking if he wanted it, in which was how he knew the situation had developed. "Talk to me," he said. She sat down across from him. "I've been analyzing the biological readings from our long-range sensors. The internal structure of the asteromorph, the cavities, the density variations. I initially read them as analogous to organ systems, circulatory, neurological, metabolic." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "But the more data I process, the more a different interpretation fits the evidence." She paused. "Daniel, the internal structures aren't just biological systems. They're storage. Enormously complex biological information storage, layered through the entire organism. The way coral builds on itself, but with..." She searched for the right comparison. "With the density and organizational complexity of an ancient crystal memory archive. Except organic. Except alive." Daniel set down his coffee. "It's carrying the information in its body. Every cell. While the genetic architecture isn't just coding for biological function. It's dual purpose. Biological instruction set and information archive. The two systems are so deeply integrated after millions of years of parallel development that you couldn't separate them without destroying both." She met his eyes. Anubis would have to essentially dissolve the organism to extract what he wants, and even then, he'd need an analytical system sophisticated enough to read biological data encoded at that density, which, given what he took from the ancient repository, he might have, Daniel finished. They sat with that for a moment. "There's something else," Carter said. "The ongoing signal. I've been running continuous analysis, and there's a pattern developing in the transmission that wasn't present in the early readings. The signal is becoming more structured, more targeted." She pulled up her tablet and showed him the waveform progression, 12 hours of transmission data compressed into a visual timeline. The early signal was complex but broadly dispersed, radiating in all directions. The current signal was a focused beam, narrowing with each passing hour, orienting with increasing precision toward a specific point. "It's not broadcasting anymore, it's aiming." Daniel looked at the directional data. What's the target coordinates?" Carter pulled up the overlay. The beam's calculated terminus, projected through Earth's atmosphere to the surface, intersected with a point in the Middle East. Daniel stared at the coordinates. Something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the lab's temperature. "That's Egypt," he said. "More specifically," Carter said quietly, "that's Giza." They briefed Hammond and O'Neill together, standing in the general's office with the kind of economy of language that comes from having delivered bad news often enough to know that preamble doesn't soften it. "The Stargates on Earth," Daniel said when he'd laid out the targeting data. "The original gate, the one Ra brought here, and the second one we found in Antarctica. The ancients didn't just build gates and distribute them. They seeded them. Placed them in specific locations tied to their larger program of human development and observation. Giza wasn't chosen randomly. It was chosen because of what the ancients knew about that location's significance across a very long timeline." He spread his hands. "If the astromorph carries biological memory of the ancient seeding programs, if somewhere in that vast organic archive is a record of Earth's gate placement and the reason for it, then Giza isn't just a geographical target. It's a memory. Something stored in its biology that's navigating it home the way salmon navigate rivers. Not thought. Instinct encoded at the cellular level across millions of years." Hammond looked at the coordinates on the screen with the expression of a man adding items to a list that was already too long. "It's heading for the original gate site. Or what that site represents in its biological memory," Daniel said. "The last place its ancestors knew as home before everything changed." O'Neill was quiet in the particular way that meant he was doing tactical calculus. "Can we use that? The targeting, can Carter use it to refine the communication signal? If we know what it's orienting toward, we know something about what it's thinking about." "Already working on it," Carter said. "Of course you are." O'Neill looked at Hammond. "Sir, We also have a Goa old fleet sitting dark on our doorstep and a timer we can't read on when Anubis decides patience is no longer serving him. He paused. I'd like to request Thor. Hammond nodded slowly. I'll make the call. Outside, the Asteromorphs' transmission beam tightened another degree toward Giza, and in its biological depths, something that had been dormant across geological time stirred toward wakefulness, recognizing through the deep grammar of cellular memory a pattern it had carried since before the first human hand had ever reached toward the stars. The memory surfaced the way continental plates move, slowly, with enormous force, and with consequences that remade everything it touched. Carter's refined transmission had done something none of them had fully anticipated, by mirroring the Asteromorphs' Giza targeting signal back at it, reflecting its own biological orientation as a structured acknowledgement, essentially saying we know what you're reaching for, we recognize its significance. She had triggered something in the organism's deep cognitive architecture that the previous exchanges had only gently disturbed. The electromagnetic transmission didn't spike this time. It didn't surge or pulse with the abrupt intensity of the earlier response. Instead, it deepened. The signal's frequency dropped below standard radio wavelengths into ranges that the SGC's equipment registered as ground-penetrating resonance, a bass note so low it was felt rather than heard, and across Cheyenne Mountain's lower levels, coffee cups vibrated on desks, and the gate room's metal ramp hummed with sympathetic frequency for 11 continuous seconds. Then the images began. Not visual images. The Asteromorph had no mechanism for generating or transmitting light-based visual data, and no reason to assume its recipients could process such things. What arrived in the signal was something Carter spent 40 minutes trying to describe accurately before settling on the term experiential impressions. Dense clusters of sensory and emotional data encoded in the signal's pattern architecture that the human brain, presented with them through the medium of Carter's translation interface, insisted on rendering as something adjacent to memory. Not dreams, not hallucinations. Something more structured and more distressing than either. Yet Daniel received them most clearly. He couldn't explain why, and Carter's working theory that his prior exposure to the ancient repository's downloading process had left his neural architecture more receptive to non-standard information encoding, was plausible enough that he didn't argue with it. What he could explain, haltingly, sitting in the briefing room with O'Neill and Hammond and Teal'c, arranged around the table and his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he kept forgetting to drink from, was what the impressions contained. There were others, he said. Not one. Many. The signal doesn't have a word for how many because quantity at that scale stops being a number and becomes a quality, like trying to count individual water molecules in an ocean. They were distributed, spread across space but interconnected. The electromagnetic sensitivity they have now, the ability to transmit and receive across vast distances. It wasn't originally a survival mechanism. It was a social one. He paused, organizing impressions that resisted linear description. They talked to each other, across the void. A civilization that didn't need planets because they were the planets, essentially, but maintained community through signal. A culture of drifting, communicating, ancient minds. And then, O'Neill said, because he'd learned to read Daniel's pauses. And then something came. Daniel set down the mug. The impression isn't visual. The cognitive architecture of the memory is structured around wrongness, around the experience of something arriving in their space that violated every pattern they understood about how existence was organized. Something that saw them not as beings but as material. He stopped. The Cubo. Whatever the Asgard's records called the Great Cruelty, the Asteromorph doesn't have a name for them either. It has a feeling for them. The feeling is... He looked for a word that would carry the weight of 1,000,000 years of trauma encoded in Livingstone. It's the feeling of hands where there should be no hands. Of being held when nothing in your experience of existence has ever involved being held against your will. The briefing room was very quiet. Teal'c spoke first. The Goa'uld take hosts by force, he said. I have heard this described by those who resisted. What the sensation of being held inside one's own body while another controls it. His jaw was set. The Jaffa call it the worst thing there is. The Asteromorph's ancestors experienced something analogous, Daniel said, but to their entire species, their entire civilization. Taken, reshaped, distributed back into the void as something other than what they had been. He looked at the table. And the ones who survived, the ones who became what we're looking at now, they remember, not as trauma that fades, as biology. Every cell carries the memory of what was done because the modification itself recorded it. The QU's engineering process was so total that the record of the process is inseparable from the result. They didn't just reshape them, Carter said quietly from her position at the side of the room, where she'd been processing the signal data throughout Daniel's account. They wrote into them. The astromorph isn't just carrying ancient genetic records, but it's carrying the record of its own transformation, the complete biological blueprint of what was done to its ancestors, encoded in living tissue that's been replicating that record faithfully for millions of years. O'Neill looked at her with the directness he deployed when tactical implications were clarifying rapidly. Anubis wants that blueprint. If he can read it, Carter said, he doesn't just get a map of ancient seeding programs. He gets the complete technical specifications of a biological engineering process that makes everything the Goa'uld have ever done with hosts and symbiotes look like. She searched for an appropriate scale, like whittling, compared to industrial manufacturing. Hammond's hands were flat on the briefing table. He could reshape species. He could design species, Carter said. Purpose-built, from scratch. Using a process refined by whatever the Q were to a level of precision we can't currently conceive of. The weight of this settled over the room like the Asteromorphs' resonance signal, felt in the bones before it was processed by the mind. O'Neill stood up. The movement was quiet and final in the way his movements got when he had finished calculating and arrived at a course of action. Then we have two jobs, he said. We keep Anubis away from it, and we figure out what it came here to find before it decides to look for it directly. He looked at Daniel. The impressions. Was there anything in them about why it came back? What it's actually looking for? Daniel was quiet for a moment, sorting through the layered, non-linear, emotional architecture of what he'd received. Others, he said finally. It's looking for the others, the ones that were taken, the community it lost. He looked up. I don't think it fully understands that millions of years have passed. Time works differently when you're drifting through the void with a metabolism that slows to near stasis between star systems. A pause. It came home because the last coordinates it had for the others, the last signal it received before the QU came, originated from this system. O'Neill looked at the ceiling briefly in the way that meant he was processing something enormous through the filter of operational necessity. It came back for its people, he said. Yes, Daniel said. And its people are us. The silence that followed that statement had the specific quality of something irreversible. Anubis moved at dawn. Not with subtlety. Subtlety had served its purpose and the calculations had shifted. 3 Haytak vessels decloaked simultaneously at the edge of Earth's moon, their pyramid silhouettes catching sunlight against the lunar surface with the deliberate theatricality of a system lord who understood that arrival was itself a weapon. The SGC's proximity alarms triggered across every station simultaneously, and within 90 seconds Hammond had the president on a secure line and Thor's hologram materializing above the gate room floor. He's not attacking, Carter said, reading the sensor data with rapid precision. No weapons hot, no death gliders launching. He's holding position. She looked up. He's positioning himself between the asteromorph and Earth. He wants to intercept it before it reaches us, O'Neill said. He wants to intercept it before we establish full communication, Hammond corrected quietly. There's a difference. Thor's hologram turned toward the general with the slow gravity of an Asgard processing multiple strategic layers simultaneously. The Beliskner and 2 support vessels are currently 40 minutes from engagement range. However, a pause that carried considerable weight. I must advise caution. Our records of previous Goa'uld attempts to interact with these organisms suggest that direct confrontation provokes responses that are disproportionate to the aggressor's expectations. The mountain swallowed the god and did not notice, Teal'c said from the doorway. A characteristically efficient summary, Thor said. O'Neill looked at the sensor feeds, showing Anubis's haystack holding lunar position, while the Asteromorph continued its patient inward drift, apparently indifferent to the goa'uld vessels now sitting in its path. The geometry of the situation was clarifying into something that required a decision faster than he would have preferred. "It doesn't know they're hostile yet," Daniel said, appearing at Carter's station with his jacket half on, reading the same feeds. "Its threat recognition systems, if it even has anything we'd recognize as those, evolved in a context where the Q were the only danger it ever encountered. It may not read goa'uld technology as threatening at all. Or, Carter said carefully, it reads everything as potentially the Q, and we just haven't triggered that response yet." The implication landed across the room without requiring elaboration. O'Neill made the call. "Thor, can you get us out there? SG-1, close approach to the Asteromorph, ahead of Anubis's position. The transport will expose your vessel to Anubis's weapons range," Thor said. "Yeah." O'Neill looked at Hammond. Sir." Hammond held his gaze for 2 seconds. "Go." Asgard beaming technology deposited SG-1 aboard a compact Asgard scout vessel, Thor's concession to the fact that humans in spacesuits represented insufficient protection for what they were about to do. 17 kilometers off the Asteromorph's leading face at 0614 hours. Through the forward viewport, the organism filled their entire field of vision. Up close, the scale defeated easy comprehension. The surface was not the uniform gray-brown of a standard asteroid. It was layered, textured with a complexity that drew the eye in and refused to release it. Ridges that might have been geological formations resolved at closer range into structures too regular for random accretion, too organic for conventional geology. Channels ran across the surface in branching patterns that Carter's instruments immediately identified as vascular. The organism's circulatory system visible on its exterior like rivers seen from altitude. And across the entire visible surface, faint bioluminescent pulses moved in slow waves, rhythmic as breathing. Blue-white light traveling through the channels in sequences that the signal analysis equipment began parsing as continuous low-level transmission before Carter had even configured it to look. "It's beautiful," Daniel said quietly, and nobody disagreed. "It's also aware of us," Carter said. "Sensor contact. It registered our arrival." She watched her readings. No change in trajectory or behavior. It's continuing. "Continuing toward Anubis," O'Neill said. And the 3 Hatak vessels had not moved from lunar position. But as SG-1 watched, the lead vessel, Anubis's command ship, identifiable by its modified superstructure, began powering its weapons array. Not targeting the Asteromorph, targeting the space immediately ahead of it, in a configuration O'Neill recognized from SGC tactical analysis as an interdiction pattern. An attempt to stop forward movement without direct engagement. "He's going to fire a warning shot," Carter said. "That's a terrible idea," Daniel said. It was. The Asteromorph's response to the staff cannon discharge that impacted 300 meters off its leading edge was not immediate. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds that felt much longer, during which the bioluminescent pulses across its surface changed character. The slow rhythmic waves replaced by something faster, more agitated, the blue-white light shifting toward a frequency that Carter's instruments logged as ultraviolet. Since then, the electromagnetic transmission surged with an intensity that overwhelmed the scout vessel's shielded receivers and sent every unshielded instrument into automatic shutdown. And the Asteromorph accelerated, not toward Earth, toward the Hatak. It moved with a speed that nothing its size had any right to achieve, and Anubis's lead vessel broke position immediately, emergency thrusters firing to clear the intercept trajectory. The other 2 Hataks scattered in opposite directions. The Asteromorph passed through the space where the command ship had been with the unhurried inevitability of a geological event, its surface now radiating ultraviolet light in cascading waves, its EM transmission so intense that Carter reported it was detectable on Earth's surface without instruments. Then it stopped, repositioned, and oriented toward the Hatak again, with a patience that was somehow more frightening than the acceleration had been. "It's not attacking," Daniel said, while watching the data. "It's warning. The pattern in the signal right now." He worked through it rapidly. "It's the same cognitive architecture as the Q memory. It thinks Anubis is them. O'Neill keyed the communication system immediately. We need to tell it the difference, he said. Right now, Daniel. Whatever you can transmit. Working on it, Daniel said, already at the signal interface. 14 kilometers away, Anubis's command ship steadied, and its weapons array came fully online. Daniel transmitted the only thing he had. Not language, not mathematics. The emotional architecture Carter had helped him build over 30 hours of signal analysis. The layered, recursive pattern structures that mirrored the Asteromorphs' own cognitive signature. He transmitted the memory impressions it had shared with them, reflected back with a modification that he hoped, with the desperate precision of a linguist working without a net, would convey the distinction he needed to make. Mar, these are not the ones who held you. We know the ones who held you. We carry that knowledge. These are different. Lesser. Known to us as enemies also. It was an approximation. A rough sketch in a medium he'd been working with for less than 2 days, transmitted toward a mind that thought in geological time. Whether it would read as meaningful communication or irrelevant noise was a question he couldn't answer until the astromorph responded. The 4 seconds of waiting felt considerably longer than 4 seconds. The ultraviolet cascade across the astromorph's surface slowed. Didn't stop. The agitation was still present, the faster pulse rhythm still running through its bioluminescent channels. But the escalating intensity plateaued. The EM transmission shifted frequency, dropping back from the overwhelming surge toward something the scout vessel's recovering instruments could process. Carter pulled up the incoming pattern analysis with hands that moved quickly and steadily, and Daniel read the results over her shoulder. It received it, he said. The Q memory pattern is still present in the signal, but it's contextualizing, comparing. He tracked the evolving pattern structure. It's looking at what we sent alongside what it already knows about the Q and running some kind of differentiation process. Like threat assessment, O'Neill said. Yeah, like grief assessment, Daniel corrected quietly. It's not just asking if Anubis is dangerous. It's asking if Anubis is responsible. There's a difference to it that matters enormously. He watched the pattern resolve. The Q took everything from it. It's been carrying that for millions of years. It doesn't want to simply defend itself. It wants to understand if what's in front of it is connected to what was done. And, O'Neill said, and we just told it no. And now it's deciding whether to believe us. 14 kilometers away, Anubis's command ship had not fired. The weapons array remained fully charged, but the targeting solution had shifted. No longer the interdiction pattern, now something Carter identified with clipped precision as a biological extraction configuration. A weapons setting adapted from ancient medical technology, designed not to destroy but to core, aimed to cut through the asteromorph's exterior and remove internal material with surgical violence. He's going for direct extraction, Carter said. He's not waiting anymore. O'Neill was already moving. Thor. The Asgard's response came through the scout vessel's communication system with the calm of someone who had been monitoring and preparing simultaneously. The Beliskner is in position, Colonel O'Neill. However, engaging Anubis's vessels directly risks escalation to full weapons exchange within Earth's gravitational sphere. If Anubis fires that extraction beam, what does the Asteromorph do? A brief pause. Based on our records of previous provocations, it responds with the full scope of its defensive capability. Another pause. Our records do not specify the upper limit of that capability. O'Neill looked through the viewport at the vast, patient, agitated surface of the asteromorph, its bioluminescent channels still running their faster rhythm, ultraviolet light pulsing in waves that cast strange shadows across the scout vessel's hull. Then he looked at the Haytak's charging weapons array. Thor, I need you to put the Beliskner between Anubis's weapons and the asteromorph. Not engaging, interposing. Make him choose between firing on an Asgard vessel or standing down. That is a considerable risk, Colonel. Yes, it is. Can you do it? Indeed, Thor said, are in a delivery so perfectly calibrated that O'Neill glanced at Teal'c involuntarily. Teal'c's expression indicated he had noticed. The Beliskener translated from hyperspace directly between Anubis's command ship and the Asteromorph with the instantaneous, non-negotiable authority of Asgard technology at full deployment. A vessel that dwarfed the Hatak, appearing in the relevant space as if it had always been there, and the Hatak was the interloper. The Protected Planets Treaty was technically void in this engagement context, but Anubis's tactical calculation didn't require the treaty. It required an assessment of whether firing on the Beliskener was worth what the Asgard would do in response. The extraction beam did not fire. The Hatak's weapons array powered down by incremental degrees, and Anubis's command ship began a slow repositioning that was not retreat. System Lords didn't retreat, but was operationally indistinguishable from it. He's pulling back, Carter said. Maintaining lunar distance. Still in system. She looked at O'Neill. He's not leaving. He doesn't need to leave, O'Neill said. He just needs to wait for a better opportunity. He turned back to the signal interface where Daniel was still monitoring the Asteromorphs' transmission patterns. Daniel, the differentiation process. Has it resolved? Daniel had been watching the pattern evolution throughout the standoff, with the focus of someone reading a text in a language they were still learning in real time. The signal architecture had continued shifting, the Q memory patterns moving through the comparative process he'd identified, the emotional framework reorganizing around the new information they'd transmitted. Yes, he said. Then he stopped. Leaned closer to the analysis display. Nah, Jack. O'Neill recognized the specific quality of Daniel's voice. What? It's not just differentiating Anubis from the Q, Daniel said slowly. The process triggered something else in the biological memory, something adjacent to the Q records. He traced the pattern on the screen. There's a recognition signal emerging, something in what we transmitted. The way we encoded knowledge of the Q, the emotional architecture of understanding what was done, activated a specific memory cluster. He looked up. It recognizes us. Not as the Q, not as enemies. He paused. As the ones who were also taken. The scout vessel was silent. It knows we're descended from the seeded populations, Carter said quietly. More than that, Daniel said. It knows we're what its people became, the other branch, on the ones the Q shaped differently. He looked through the viewport at the vast living surface beyond the glass. It's not looking for its civilization anymore. It's looking at it. The recognition changed everything and solved nothing. Daniel transmitted continuously for 2 hours, building on the breakthrough with the focused desperation of someone constructing a bridge across a chasm while the ground on both sides shifted. The emotional architecture he was working with had expanded significantly since the recognition signal. The Asteromorphs' transmissions were now richer, more layered, organized around the new framework of understanding that humanity represented a parallel branch of the same violated ancestry. It was communicating with the urgency of something that had been silent for geological epochs and had abruptly found a reason to speak. What it was saying was not simple. It's not anger, Daniel said, working through the pattern analysis while Carter monitored Anubis's repositioning at lunar distance, and Teal'c stood at the viewport watching the Asteromorph's bioluminescent surface with the attentiveness of a warrior who had learned to read unfamiliar threats through patient observation. The emotional architecture around its recognition of humanity isn't structured like aggression, or even grief exactly. It's more like the feeling of arriving somewhere you've been trying to reach for so long that arrival itself is almost incomprehensible. He paused. It's been alone. Genuinely alone in ways we don't have adequate frameworks for. The community it lost wasn't just social, it was cognitive. These organisms think better together. The interconnected signal network they maintained was part of their actual cognition, not just communication. Losing that wasn't like losing contact with friends, and it was like losing part of your own mind. And now it's found something adjacent to what it lost, O'Neill said. It's found the descendants of its people, shaped differently, scaled differently, operating on completely different biological parameters, but carrying in our genome the trace record of the same origin. Daniel looked at his hands briefly. It wants to re-establish connection. The targeting signal toward Giza wasn't just navigational memory. It was the asteromorph orienting toward the strongest concentration of the genetic signature it recognizes. 8 billion humans on one planet is, from its perspective, an extraordinary signal density. Carter looked up from her station. That's also what makes it dangerous. Her voice was careful and precise in the way it got when she was delivering information she'd prefer not to deliver. Yeah, the biological archive it carries, the Q's engineering records embedded in its cellular structure. If it attempts direct biological interaction with human genetic material, we have no way of predicting what that triggers. The Q's modifications were designed to be permanent and self-propagating. Contact between the Asteromorphs' biological systems and human DNA could potentially activate something, O'Neill said. Reactivate something, Carter corrected. Something dormant in human genetic architecture for millions of years that the Q put there and the ancient seeding program may have deliberately suppressed. She met his eyes. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it does. And we don't know if it's reversible. O'Neill looked through the viewport. The astromorph had closed to 9 kilometers during the communication exchange, moving with the slow inexorability of something that didn't experience 9 kilometers as a meaningful distance. Its surface pulses had shifted again. The agitation of the earlier encounter with Anubis replaced by something rhythmically slower, almost meditative, the bioluminescent channels running deep blue sequences that Carter's instruments parsed as the organism's baseline resting transmission. It was, in whatever sense the term applied to a 300-meter living asteroid, calm. It was also still moving toward Earth. Daniel, O'Neill said, can you tell it to stop? Daniel was quiet for a moment that contained a complicated ethical calculation. I can try. But Jack, if I transmit a signal that reads as rejection from the only beings it's recognized as kin in millions of years. I know. The psychological architecture of what it's experiencing right now is extremely fragile. It's restructured its entire cognitive framework around this recognition. If we... Daniel. I know. O'Neill's voice was level and tired. Find a way to tell it to stop. That isn't rejection. Tell it we need time. Tell it. He searched briefly. Tell it we're not ready yet. Daniel turned to the signal interface and began constructing the transmission with the care of someone disarming something that could destroy everything if handled incorrectly. He was halfway through the construction when Anubis moved. Not the Hatak fleet. They held position. What moved was smaller. So the cloaked Teltak scout that Takra intelligence had warned about, that had been sitting dark in lunar shadow since before SG-1 had arrived, that had spent the entire engagement waiting for exactly this moment of focused attention elsewhere. Carter's instruments caught it at 4 kilometers, close enough for targeted biological extraction, the kind of precision sampling that didn't require the organism to cooperate or survive intact. Teltak, 4 kilometers, weapons charging, Carter said. Her voice stripped to pure data. Extraction beam configuration. The astromorph registered it simultaneously. The bioluminescent channels surged white. Not ultraviolet threat response, something different. Something that Carter's instruments had no prior reading for. And the EM transmission spiked to a frequency that bypassed the scout vessel's shielding entirely and hit Daniel's neural architecture like a physical blow. He gasped, grabbed the console. Daniel... O'Neill was at his side immediately. Daniel steadied himself, blinking hard. It's not hurting me. It's transmitting directly, bypassing the interface. He pressed one hand flat against the console and closed his eyes. It's frightened. The Teltak read as the approach vector, the weapons configuration. It's identical to a Q extraction pattern. It doesn't know it's Goa old. It thinks... The astromorph's surface erupted. Not weapons fire. Not the geological violence of physical impact. Every bioluminescent channel across its entire visible surface discharged simultaneously in a focused electromagnetic pulse of staggering intensity that hit the Teltak broadside and stopped every system aboard in a single instant. Drives, weapons, life support, structural integrity fields. All of it, simultaneously and completely, as though the concept of powered systems had been locally suspended. The Teltak went dark and began to drift. The Anubis's extraction team, Teal'c said, watching the dead vessel tumble slowly against the stars. They will not be completing their mission. O'Neill exhaled, looked at Daniel, who was still gripping the console with white knuckles, eyes open now, processing something internal. You okay? It shared something with me, Daniel said quietly. When it transmitted directly. A complete memory cluster, not just impressions. A specific memory. He looked up. It knows what the Q put in us. Not the dormant sequence Carter was worried about. He paused. It's not a weapon. It's not a modification designed for control. He seemed to need a moment with what he was about to say. It's a message. The QU encoded a message into human genetic architecture millions of years ago, and the Asteromorph has been carrying the key to reading it ever since. O'Neill stared at him. What does it say? Daniel looked through the viewport at the vast, ancient, luminous surface filling their sky. It says we're sorry, he said. The apology was 4 million years old, and it changed nothing and everything simultaneously. Daniel spent the transit back to Earth, Thor beaming SG-1 directly to the SGC gate room, while Asgard vessels maintained position around the Asteromorph with the careful, respectful distance of beings who had just watched it disable a Goa'uld Teltak without apparent effort, trying to articulate what the direct transmission had contained. Hammond listened across the briefing room table with the stillness of a man who had learned that the universe was larger and stranger than human frameworks comfortably accommodated, and that his job was to make operational decisions within that discomfort anyway. The Q weren't purely malevolent, Daniel said. I know that's difficult to reconcile with what they did, but the memory architecture of the apology sequence is genuine, authenticated by the Asteromorph's own emotional framework around it, which has no mechanism for deception at that cognitive level. He organized his thoughts carefully. They were scientists, catastrophically arrogant scientists operating on a scale of biological intervention that we can barely conceptualize, who reshaped species across multiple star systems in pursuit of something they believed was necessary, important, a project with a purpose they considered worth the cost. He paused. At some point they understood the cost more clearly. The message encoded in human DNA is the record of that understanding. An acknowledgement addressed to every species they modified, written into the most durable medium they had access to, our own biology, because they knew they wouldn't survive to deliver it in person. They're gone, Hammond said. Long gone. The Asteromorph's memory of them ends with the message encoding. Whatever came after that, wherever the Q went or what ended them, it doesn't know. Daniel spread his hands. But it carried the key to the message for millions of years without knowing what the message said. It just knew the key existed and that the ones who needed it were somewhere near a particular star. Hammond sat with this for a moment. Outside the briefing room windows, the gate room was quiet, the Stargate dormant, its ring of chevrons dark and patient. Son, the genetic sequence Carter identified, he said. The dormant element. Can it be read without consequences? The Asteromorph shared the decryption architecture with me directly, Daniel said. Carter believes she can use it to read the sequence without activating it. It was designed to be read, not triggered. The Q encoded it as information, not instruction. Whatever it contains, he paused. We think it's a complete record of every species they modified, every world, every change made and the reasoning behind it. He looked at Hammond steadily. It's the most comprehensive biological and historical record in the galaxy, possibly more complete than anything in the ancient database. Hammond looked at the table for a long moment. And Anubis. Still at lunar distance, Carter said from the doorway, where she'd appeared silently sometime during Daniel's account, tablet in hand. Thor's vessels have established a perimeter. He's not leaving, but he's not moving closer either. She crossed to the table. The Teltak crew survived. The Asteromorphs pulse disabled systems without generating heat or concussive force. They're drifting in a dead ship. Anubis won't recover them. Too exposed. A pause. He knows what happened. He'll adapt his approach. He always does, O'Neill said from his chair, where he'd been listening with his arms crossed and the particular expression he wore when a mission had resolved its immediate crisis while generating 3 new ones. What does it want? Long term, now that it's found us. Daniel looked at the table. To not be alone, he said simply. That's underneath all the complexity of the biological archive and the Q records and the genetic message. That's the operational truth of why it came. It maintained signal contact with what it thought were the last coordinates of its civilization, and traveled toward them across millions of years because the alternative was continuing to drift in silence. He looked up. It's not asking to land. It's not asking for anything that would threaten us. It wants what it's had for the last 12 hours. Signal contact. Exchange. The cognitive connection that its species requires the way we require oxygen. It wants to talk, O'Neill said. It wants to not stop talking, Daniel corrected. There's a difference. Hammond stood, moved to the briefing room window and looked down at the gate room below. The Stargate's familiar ring, the ramp, the iris that had stopped so many things that meant harm. He was quiet for a moment that the rest of the room respected. Establish a permanent signal relay, he said finally. So work with Thor to position Asgard communication equipment at sufficient range for ongoing contact without proximity risk. Carter, begin working on reading the genetic sequence using the decryption architecture Daniel received. He turned from the window. And Daniel, tell it we're listening. Daniel nodded. He was already composing the transmission in his mind, organizing the emotional architecture of, we hear you, we're here. You're not alone into the layered recursive patterns that the Asteromorph would recognize as genuine. As SG-1 dispersed to their respective tasks, O'Neill paused at the briefing room door and looked back at Hammond. Sir, the message in our DNA, when Carter reads it, whatever the cue we're trying to say to every species they ever touched, we'll deal with it, Hammond said. O'Neill nodded once and left. In the cold distance beyond the moon, the Asteromorph held its position with the patience of deep time, its bioluminescent channels running their slow blue rhythms against the dark. Its transmission continued steady and clear. No longer the searching, desperate signal of something that had been alone too long, but something quieter and more settled. The signal of something that had arrived, finally, after a journey measured not in light years but in epochs. It was waiting for Daniel's response. Somewhere in the SGC's lower levels, the Carter was already reading 4 million years of apology written in human blood, and the gate room's chevrons waited in silence for whatever address the next mission would require. The stars, as always, had more to say. The Asteromorph remained. Not landed, not threatening. Present. A 300-meter living monument to what humanity might have become, drifting in patient orbit beyond the moon, maintaining continuous signal contact through the relay network, Thor helped Carter establish within 72 hours of the first transmission. Anubis withdrew from the system after 4 days, which meant he was planning something that required preparation. The SGC logged the certainty of his return and filed it alongside every other certainty they had learned to live with. Daniel spent 3 weeks working with the Asteromorph's direct transmissions, building a communication framework sophisticated enough to be called, cautiously, a language. Carter spent the same 3 weeks reading the Q's encoded message in human DNA, a document of such staggering scope that she requested indefinite research authorization and received it without debate. What she found in the sequence confirmed what Daniel's transmitted impressions had suggested. Every seeded world, every modified species, every Q intervention recorded with the completeness of a civilization that understood, too late, that what they had done required accounting for. The Jaffa oral tradition would eventually be revised. The mountain that breathed had a name now, of sorts, a signal signature that Daniel rendered imperfectly as the one who remembers. It did remember. Everything. And for the first time in 4 million years, it had someone to remember with. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. More stories await.